Director for UCAL Products Private Limited and UCAL Auto Private Limited. Shri C.V. Karthik Narayanan, Trustee, Chatnath Trust. Shri T.M. Krishna, one of India's foremost classical vocalists. Professor Nigel Osborne, Emeritus Professor, University of Edinburgh, UK. Professor Michael R. Trimble, Emeritus Professor of Behavioral Neurology, University College London, UK. We request you all to rise for the invocation.
Ganesha Stutihi.
Gajananam bhutaganaadhisevitam kapithajambuphalasara bhakshitam umasutam shokavinashakaranam namami Vigneshwara pada pankajam.
Professor, there. Yeah, please. We request Dr. E.S. Krishnamurthy to present the traditional Ponnadai to Professor Michael Trimble. Professor Nigel Osborne. And Shri T.M. Krishna. Thank you, Doctor. We call on Ms. Gayatri Shri. We call on Ms. Gayatri Shriram for the welcome address.
Good evening. Dignitaries on and off the dais, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. On behalf of the K. Kopalak Krishna family and Chatnath Trust, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to the 27th K. Kopalak Krishna Endowment Oration, Laughing or Crying, Are They Good For You? And the inauguration of the Musical Brain from Science to Therapy workshop. This function is held every year to commemorate the memory of Sri K. Kopalak Krishna, who started his career as a Dubash with Galanda's Arbuthnot and went on to become one of India's automobile pioneers with the establishment Standard Motor Company and Union Company. His automotive vision lives on as the UCAL group of companies, and his social vision through the Chatnath Trust, which is associated with the SOS Children's Villages of India Chatnath Homes and Kannaprayag Trust and the K. Kopalak Krishna Department of Neurology at VHS Hospital. Chatnath Trust is delighted to be associated with these series of lectures and will continue to support efforts both in education and healthcare in the years to come. This year, the oration forms part of the scientific workshop, The Musical Brain from Science to Therapy, led by Professor Michael Trimble of London and Professor Nigel Osborne from Edinburgh, both trustees of the Musical Brain Trust in London. We welcome both of you to Chennai, and also Tina Lee, Artistic Director of the Opera Circus, and the team from Musical Brain and Opera Circus from London. Professor Michael Trimble, Emeritus Professor of Behavioral Neurology, University College London, who is delivering this year's oration, is an international leader in the mini-brain interface in the field of neuropsychiatry. He has over 300 publications and 30 books to his credit. Two of his popular science works, The Soul in the Brain, published by Johns Hopkins in 2010, and Why Humans Like to Cry by Oxford University Press in 2012, have received much acclaim. This year's lecture will be followed by a special presentation by T.M. Krishna, the legendary Chennai-based musician who is revolutionizing Carnatic music with his innovations. His presentation is Aesthetics to Emotion, Perspectives from Carnatic Music. This program has been organized by NeuroKrish, the Chennai-based neuropsychiatry group, and TriMed, India's first integrative medical therapy center chain, both led by Dr. Ennapadam S. Krishnamurthy, who has been instrumental in bringing us thought-provoking and insightful orations over the past few years. I am sure this year will not be an exception, and Chatna Trust intends to support these efforts in the future. I am delighted that over 250 people, medical professionals, scientists and lay intelligentsia will be taking part over these 2 days, and that a follow-up music therapy consensus building workshop in Vidyasagar, in which the Health Secretary Shri Keshav Desiraju will take part, has been also organized on the 5th of November. We as a family are extremely happy to be involved in these discussions and developments that benefit science and medicine, and we thank the organizers, the participants and the press for being part of these proceedings. Again, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you, and I hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. We have great pleasure in inviting C.V. Karthik Narayanan to inaugurate the musical brain program by lighting the traditional Kuthuvalakku and request all the dignitaries on the dais to join him. We would like to now request Sri C.V. Karthik Narayanan to deliver the presidential address.
Professor Trimble, Professor Osborne, my good friend Mahesh, Gayatri and friends. Mahesh has given me 2 minutes for this inaugural speech, and even that will be a bit too much. Gayatri has already explained to you about our trust. It was founded in 1966 by Mr. K. Kopalak Krishna with the primary objective of doing what it can to help people in society, and it has involved itself quite extensively and has been responsible for quite a few organizations. The SOS Children's Village Chatnath Homes has been founded in property donated by the trust, which, as you know, is one of the premier institutions in the country, international institutions. Then we have Karnaprayak Trust, which basically looks after abandoned children in foundlings and takes care of them and gives them in adoption. This particular activity, which is the brainchild of Dr. E.S. Krishnamurthy Srinivas, when he was leading the K. Kopalak Krishna Department of Neurology in the VHS, which has been donated by the trust. And this is the 27th lecture, and we are delighted that Professor is here to talk to us about a very, very familiar, not a very familiar topic. It happens all the time, but we don't know the reason why it happens and what the consequences are, which is laughter and crying. And to take a subject like that and research and produce information to all of us is something which I am personally looking forward to, and I'm sure all of you are looking forward to. So thank you once again for coming here and participating in such large numbers, and like you, I also look forward to the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We now request you to present the oration plaque to Professor Emma Trimble, the 27th K. Kopalak Krishna Endowment Orator. And we request Mrs. Meenakshi Jayakar to present a bouquet to Professor Trimble. A warm welcome to Shri T.M. Krishna. He is just joining us. Sir, would we please request you to join everybody on the dais? Dr. Krishnamurthy, may we request you to welcome. Dr. Krishnamurthy, may we request you to welcome Shri T.M. Krishna with the traditional Ponnadai. Thank you, sir. We have great pleasure in inviting Professor Michael R. Trimble to deliver the oration on laughing and crying. Are they good for you?
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been to Chennai several times, and it's always a very great pleasure and honor to be invited. And it is always full of surprises for me when I come here. And today I've had a marvelous day. I just wanted to say how grateful I was to Mrs. Narayanan, who has taken me to one of her SOS villages, where I have seen some of the most, if I said beautiful things, it would not be exaggerating. In many ways enough to lead an older man to cry. I'm not going to do that now, but that was a wonderful start. And then to have a nice full audience here to talk about a topic such as crying, but I am going to talk a little bit about laughing. I want also to obviously to thank the Kopalak Krishna Foundation for helping with these meetings. With Nigel Osborne, I really think this is quite unique. Neither of us, I think, have an idea of other meetings where we try to discuss in some considerable detail similarities and differences between different cultures of music, comparing Western music to Indian music. And then I need to thank I call him Krish Jr. because I know of Krish Sr. and I know of Krish Jr., both of whom, of course, well known in the neurological field. And I thank Krish very much for the organization of putting this together and his own particular interest in neuropsychiatry, namely the bridge between neurology and psychiatry, which brings us into links between emotions and the brain. So many thanks to everybody. I'm going to start out by talking about why humans like to cry, but I want to put this in the context of laughing as well, although the majority of my presentation is going to be about crying. Now, it is of interest that This came up the other day when I was looking at the newspapers, and it says, when I see an elephant cry, and it said, newborns weep in despair after being parted from mother who tried to kill him. Now, my presentation is going to be based on the confirmed view that only human beings cry emotionally. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on why that is in a moment. But I know that somebody's going to say, what about Indian elephants? They cry, don't they? Well, this is very interesting because there's actually a book about this called When Elephants Weep. And the conclusion from that book was that most elephant watchers have never seen an elephant cry, or weep emotionally, that is. But there's something interesting about this photograph. Elephants, of course, have a long trunk, and that is equivalent to our human nose. And tears come from the eyes, and they keep the eye moist. So we continually produce tears, and they escape down the nose. Now, for the elephant, it is the same. They escape down the trunk. But look at this elephant. It's lying down. And when the elephant lies down, the tears cannot escape down the trunk. They escape from the eyes, and they go down the cheeks. So I am yet to be convinced that Indian elephants cry tears emotionally. However, afterwards, if any of you have anecdotal evidence about that, I'm pleased to hear it. Because Darwin had anecdotal evidence, but he, like a number of other people, said that in his view it was only human beings that cried. Now, Darwin was not convinced that crying tears could have any evolutionary significance, which is why I want to put something to do with evolution into my story. I'm also going to talk a little bit about crying to the arts, particularly to music, as music is the theme of the meeting. But just to go back to the earliest written texts, not only in the West but in others, you can find ideas about crying in very, very early texts, such as the Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia. You can find ideas that tears are related to the seasons, that tears relate to rain, tears relate to rejuvenation of fertility, and also that tears relate to cleansing. All of these ideas you can find in early mythology. And the interesting thing about tears in Homer's Iliad is it's the guys who cry. It's the men, the heroes, who have the tears. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So if it is the case that there must have been a point in evolution when the tear became of importance to our hominid ancestors, I suggest there must be some anatomical differences between our brains and the brains of our very, very early ancestors. And I'm here referring to the chimpanzees, namely the apes. I'm not going to discuss much neuroanatomy, but those of you who are interested, I shall talk more about it tomorrow. Why do only humans cry emotionally? And what about crying as opposed to laughing? Now, if you say to somebody, what is the opposite of laughing, they will say crying. Now, I just want to show you that that is simply not the case, and that crying is really very special, as indeed laughing is. So, from an anthropological perspective, laughing may occur, or equivalence to laughing may occur in, say, chimpanzees, particularly while at play. I've never been very convinced of that, but people who observe animals carefully say this is an equivalent of human laughing. but as I've said, crying is exclusively a human attribute. Now, laughing occurs in many different settings. Could I just have a show of hands? How many of you have laughed today? Somebody's even laughing now. Put your hand up. And more of you are laughing now. Could anybody who has cried today please put their hands up? So, there are 2 or 3 or 4 people, 5 people. But here is an immediate difference between laughing and crying. Laughing actually is used very often as a gesture when you meet people. Hello, I haven't seen you for... laugh, laugh, laugh. And it's a very, very important human communication. But actually, if somebody bursts out crying when they see you, that is sometimes associated with seeing somebody you haven't seen for a very long time. But usually you would be a little worried. Interestingly, therefore, laughter usually occurs in social settings, whereas crying mostly, of course there are communal settings for crying, but mostly crying occurs alone or alone with a highly significant other person. Totally different from laughing. Then obviously the emotion release is positive with laughter and negative in relationship to crying. But both laughing and crying say something about the state of mind of the person doing the laughing and crying. I've mentioned that there are differences in the frequency of these, but there are also differences in the reasons for laughing and crying. You know, one of the ways that humans laugh is through jokes. Now, I do not believe that chimpanzees tell jokes. Well, some people suggest they are able to tell jokes, but I don't think they would understand our kind of jokes. Because to tell a good joke, what you have to do is to defy logic. So, in other words, often there's 3 people. The first one is this, the second one is this, and the third one does something completely contrary and defies logic. There's a much higher intellectual component about telling and laughing to jokes than with crying. Crying occurs in a lot of settings related to pain, to loss, and to bereavement. But it isn't associated, if I can put it like this, with higher logical conclusions. And the art forms, which I'll come back to, obviously are different. The crying being related in particular to tragedy, and I want to talk a bit about tragedy and its relationship to music. Then the physiology of it. I maintain there's a different anatomy and there's a different physiology. So when you laugh, laughter is mainly an expiration. Ha, 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 ha. Crying is actually more in inspiration. That suggests to me a different neuronal organization. The eyes, of course, are different. In laughing, the eyes sparkle. In crying, the eyes blur. And also, the onset is different. So you all had a good laugh. Most of you have. But you've got over that. You're hopefully listening to me now. However, if you cry, particularly crying emotionally, you find that it has a very slow resolution. So I hope those few who already cried today are in a sufficiently calmer mood to listen to my lecture now. But there's something also important. Crying doesn't come on suddenly. It wells up inside. And the origin, and I'd like you just to think about this, because you've all just laughed, or a lot of you have. Where is that feeling in the body? Well, actually, it's mainly somewhere up here. Where does crying come from? Crying is actually a gut feeling. You feel it in the guts, and you have a momentary ability to somehow stop that sometimes. But it's a gut feeling, and there's anatomical reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into in any particular detail. So a little bit of basic background information. Crying and laughing. Babies have facial expressions at birth. Laughing begins, as does crying, with tears around, a few weeks of age, 3 to 4 months. But I want to distinguish between a baby that wails, that shouts out screaming, which happens immediately. Of course, the first thing a baby has to do is to cry to show it's alive. But the wailing that a little baby does, is different from the tears which emerge about 4 months. Now, I have spoken to a number of mothers about this, and they say to me that when the baby begins to cry tears, it signals to them that the baby doesn't just scream out for wanting food or discomfort, but it's for actually wanting mother. And their relationship changes when they see the tears. And this has important consequences because it's related very closely to infant-maternal bonding. And one implication of what I'm saying is that these very, very early infant-maternal feelings that are generated within us when we are very small are carried on in significant ways to adulthood. This is a painting, Bruegel the Elder. It's called The Sense of Hearing. Now, what interests me particularly about this painting was that here you have mother and baby, and it's the musical instruments which are echoing from the mother into the child. And it also shows you the huge influence of music in the very, very early infant development. It's also quite interesting that tucked away here is all kinds of other extraneous noises that go on all around. And yet there's something about music that captivates babies and later on in life captivates us. And part of it is, of course, what happens when the mother goes to the infant who is shedding tears. Now, of course, what does she do? It's an immediate signal of some kind of distress and wanting. There's an infant-maternal interaction, and the mother speaks to the baby. But she doesn't speak in adult frequencies. She speaks in much higher frequencies. This is baby speak. And further, she will do two other things of great importance. She moves, she holds, and she moves, she rocks. And of course, the infant is used to rhythm from fetal days onwards, but she rocks and she sings. And what does she sing? She sings lullabies. And lullabies are the first essential languages of emotional bonding that the small child learns. And the thing about lullabies, or one of the things about lullabies, is that they are sung in a frequency which is above that of the speaking frequency. The frequency of lullabies, Nigel, I hope I'm right about this, but it is relatively equivalent to those of the soprano, which leads us in later life to cry. So again, here's a link between those very early feelings that we develop quite unconsciously when we're very, very small animals, babies, into later life. Now, I've written down there a quotation from one of my mentors who I always like to quote this because it's an evolutionary phrase, but it says an awful lot. The history of the evolution of the limbic system is the history of the evolution of the mammals. And the history of the evolution of the mammals is the history of the evolution of the family. So what all mammals have, by definition, is mothers. And I've just emphasized the importance of mothers in the infant interaction. For example, if you're a reptile and you hatch out of an egg, you come into the world and you cry out, you will be heard and you will be eaten. If you're a baby born to a mammal, if you don't cry out, you will not survive. So the separation call, infant to mother, is vitally binding in mammalian species. And the point about the quote is that the limbic system, this is often referred to as the emotional parts of the brain, it increases in size in the brain in relationship to the complexity of the social and familial environment. up to the size that we have in the human. It's often thought that it's only our top parts of the brain, the so-called cerebral cortex, which endows humans with all that's so important. But actually, those limbic structures have also developed extremely importantly in the course of hominid evolution, including those leading to Homo sapiens. So, tears are, from infants, a communication pleading a certain kind of need. And the infant eye and the cry brings the closeness of the mother with her caresses, but more with her rocking and with her lullabies, and with a resolving of the emotion, a release or a decrease of the emotion that had built up leading to the crying. So there's already a hint here that when we stop crying, or the act of crying may lead to something positive. And in adults, of course, this will be much more controlled and released by appropriate stimuli. Now, what I put down there is autobiographical memories, and the autobiographical memories are clearly relevant to this story. In other words, when you become an adult, what it is that leads you to cry, in fact, is the memories that have been built up, emotional memories surrounding our lives from those very, very early days. Pablo Picasso did a whole series of images of weeping women. It's said that he probably was responsible for quite a lot of their weeping. But it is an interesting question as to what it is that leads women to cry. Now, this is an obvious image, and it kind of says that if you really want to cry, you should cut up an onion. And it's been well known for a very, very long time that if you feel you should cry, but worry you will not, then you put an onion in your handkerchief. And so spouses who should be deeply bereaved at the loss of their husband and wife, but actually may not be, know that they have to use an onion. And of course, if you didn't want to lose your life when the emperor, king, or leader died, and you were not seen to be crying, then of course again the onion became very important to bring on the tears. Anyway, that's one issue. But there is this interesting fact that women, or females, cry more than men. And this is a universal finding. And it could be that it's just the case, that women have more to cry about. That's the women are rather nodding there, the men are looking a bit serious down here. But it could be that's the case. But there are some interesting biological aspects to this. One is that this gender gap between male and female crying probably becomes more apparent at puberty, or at least around the ages of, say, 12 to 14. And it's not apparent in younger children. Secondly, in terms of emotional issues, it's again quite universally found that women have more depressive illness than men do. And the third thing of interest, I think, is that over the last 30 years, the role of women, particularly in Western societies, has altered quite dramatically in terms of their independence, their job opportunities, their self-expression. But this gender gap, the difference in frequency of crying between men and women, does not appear to have altered. So there does appear to be some biological relevance to the fact that women shed tears more easily than males. That is, it's not explained, but I think it is more than just a sociological variable. But this is Murray, our famous Scottish tennis player, who was known for being a very, very, if I said hard-hearted Scot, is that reasonable? So And anyway, here he is having won some notable tournament, and at last he broke down and showed tears. And it is a fact, I think, that this gender difference between males and females is likely to change in this respect, that now, if the images of the president or Murray or somebody else, a famous star, can be seen crying, that is the image that gets onto the television, onto the satellite, into the newspapers. So, you know, President Obama, when he gets re-elected, they don't show a picture of him just being happy, they have to show a picture of him crying. So it's okay for you chaps, for you men, if you feel you want to cry. It's becoming all right. Human emotional crying, because after domestic arguments, really doesn't resolve problems necessarily. And if domestic arguments continue, then you will be left with bad feelings. But it is quite interesting in domestic settings where you have arguments that are going on and on and on. It's often the breakdown of one of the two people that will break things and will resolve those issues. And you say, okay, let's talk about it and not argue about it. So I think this is one way that the tear is an iconic signal for a change of behavior in the other. Death, particularly of a friend, but also of a relative, underlying all of this is loss. People cry readily to loss of many things. Loss of opportunities, loss of occupation, loss of personal possessions, whatever it is that is symbolically and emotionally important to you, loss is something that will provoke tears. Now, a bit further down, I put relationship to art, and I'm coming back to that in a moment, but I just want to hinge this again back to music, because you can see at the top of my list, music, poetry, novels, etc., we have music. So, this is of interest, I hope. This is a very famous image of the Italian artist Masaccio, Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden. Now, what more tragic event could Homo sapiens have? And it's interesting that the image of Adam crying is almost as if he doesn't want to be seen. He's shading either from God or from whoever else might be looking, the animals, but there's no tears. And it's of singular interest to me that in visual representations of art, in the West at least, now again, if you can produce some images for me, I'd be delighted to include them in the lecture, but in the West at least, very, very few images can you find of the tear. And these are usually related to religious images, and occasionally there are images of Christ's tears, Lacrima Christi. But you go to art galleries and you see many, many religious paintings, you see lots of other paintings. I've shown you the Picasso, but really, in terms of the importance of this emotion and the importance of portraying emotion in visual arts, it's of interest how infrequently you ever see tears. Now, this is the only statue I have ever found whereby there is a tear. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's certainly there. And the Bernini here has actually put tears down the side of Persephone as she is being violated in a most unruly way by Zeus, as usual. So tears are extremely important, and this actually is another artistic image, although it's a photograph reconstruction. But I just wanted to use this to illustrate two things. Again, the importance of the tear as a signal, as a cipher in the human face. And secondly, the eye. I want to just, I'm going to come back to the eye in a moment, but notice the eye, the iris surrounded by the white sclera, how the eye center, the iris, is highlighted by the surrounding sclera. There has been a study done not just recently on tears enhancing the emotional signal. What the investigators did was take 80 volunteers and showed them 50 images of faces with tears. And then they showed them 50 images of crying people, but with the tears removed, and they had some distractors as controls. And when the images of the tears removed were rated, the images were rated as much less sad. So that the actual sign of the tear signals a huge amount, which just the eye or the face doesn't do. Although, of course, in crying, the whole of the facial structure is altered, and of course in different ways anatomically to laughing. So crying leads to a social response, and part of that social response relates to English words, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Now, this is very difficult to follow in some ways, because in different languages these words have different stems. They come from different origins. And they don't all mean the same, but they have this idea behind them. Sympathy, pathy, feelings, sympathy, sympathetic, being with another. And having empathy is having emotion or feelings in pathy, you're feeling in. And compassion is obviously with passion. So all of these ideas have to do with crying that leads to a detection of the feeling in the other. And these are words, sympathy, empathy, and compassion, which I believe, again, are crucial to underlying human morality. These memories that we have, which are impregnated with emotion, obviously leads to an autobiographical link here. And then, in a moment, I'm going to show you briefly the issue about mirror neurons. Now, mirror neurons have hit the headlines as being one of the most interesting or whatever facets of human neuroscience to be discovered in the last few years. That may be so. I think it may be so. On the other hand, like all of these discoveries, there are people who consider that they're overhyped, that there's too much to it. But I'm not sure. This is Horace. If thou wish me to weep, thou must first shed tears thyself, then thy sorrows will touch me. Thy sorrows. Sympathy will touch me. Empathy. So the idea of mirrored tears is clearly not new. For those of you who just want a 1-second rundown, and I apologize to neuroscientists who are working in this field, who may be here, for cutting this down to a diagram like this, but they were discovered as follows. Here is a monkey, and in his brain he had an electrodes implanted, recording activity in parts of the brain. And it was noted that when the monkey made this movement, here to pick up a banana, made the movement, certain neurons in the what's called the premotor cortex, but part of the brain, were activated. Well, there's nothing new about that, because obviously when you make a movement, something happens in your brain, and we know that parts of the brain relate to movement. What was most interesting was that when the monkey saw something else, and in this case it was a human hand, but initially it was another monkey, but when they saw the same action being carried out, but they did not carry it out, the same neurons were shown to be active. So in other words, when somebody approaches you and when somebody is expressing something to you, either a motion, a movement, or an emotion, there can be shown to be activity in your brain that corresponds to activity going on in their brain. So this is why it's called mirror neurons. And this rather naively, I think, again it's a cartoon, but it does express what's happening here. The reason I like this is because it's eye-to-eye contact. And this is frontal cortex, and well, this is partly in relationship to where some of these actions go on. But the idea is that when you are actually seeing somebody, you are able in your own brain to have an unconscious feeling or an unconscious tendency to move, which corresponds to the person that you're interacting with. Now, the limbic areas have been described for many years, and I'm not going to give an anatomy lesson at all here, but what is quite interesting is that these areas that relate to mirror neuron activity do indeed relate to some of these limbic structures. One of them, which is not shown here, is called the insula, but the interest is that it's these areas of the brain here, part of what's called the frontal cortex, which we know has expanded greatly in Homo sapiens, in human brain, in relationship to chimpanzee brains, particularly these medial structures here, what's called the medial ventral prefrontal cortex. And these areas seem to be very, very sensitive to social interactions being activated by the mirror neuron system, but also the system which is referred to as related to empathy. And these areas are closely interlinked with limbic structures, and I'm not going to elaborate on that anymore, except to say that neuroscience in the past 10, 20 years, for the first time really, neurologists have got interested in emotion, and secondly, you can actually raise grants from grant-giving bodies to study things like emotion, empathy, and social cognition. This is a very, very active area of science. So seeing crying elicits activity in your own brain in areas that lead you to be emotional, and there is a response. Now, talked about the response in several areas, but what about the arts? And this, of course, brings us to music. With some colleagues, I've carried out a number of studies, epidemiological studies, in relationship to crying in response to the arts. And we've carried out these studies in Japan, in Europe, and Krish is going to help us study population of people here in Chennai. But what you can see, I can't quite point to it because it's just round the corner from where I am, but round there somewhere you have poetry, and then novels, biography. That'll come back to in just a second, but look over to the far right. In fact, whether you're European or Japanese, it is music that is the thing that leads you to cry. I'm not talking about just feeling good or whatever, or feeling bad, but to cry. Music releases tears in these two populations widely spread apart. But of interest, remember what I was talking about? Paintings and sculptures? When you ask people, do they cry in response to looking at paintings? We really are down to 10 to 20%. Statues and buildings, architecture. I mean, architects are so important in terms of the development of our culture, going back from the temples to the present time. Yet nobody breaks down in tears when they stand in front of a most beautiful building. It's music all the time. And this just takes out a little bit further and talks about response to the arts by gender. Again, women rather more than men, but again, it's the same problem. Now, I just wanted to pick up here this rather interesting fact that novels are rated highly, but particularly highly with women. And I'm not, if you read novels, then people say, well, there's great novels. And now in England or in the West, we have a thing called chick lit. Have you heard of chick lit? All right, so I don't know whether it's chick lit or whether it's Dostoevsky that leads to the crying, but it is of interest that what happens when you're reading a novel, a story, is that you travel in time with somebody else, with their emotions, and also referring back to Matt Osborne's comments earlier on about well, in the West we perhaps make too much about closure. If you don't have closure in a novel, Nigel, you've read 900 pages, you'd be rather distressed. So the closure aspect is very important. But it's very interesting that novels should rate so highly in terms of evoking tears. But there is something else quite interesting from a response to our perspective, that I know we have CDs and DVDs, and they are probably very, very dangerous for music, because what's happening is you're in the middle of listening to a wonderful aria in an opera, and the doorbell goes, and you have to push the stop button and get up, and you can't come back to it. In the same way, that's the importance of going to the opera and listening to it in the opera. But actually with a novel, you say, oh, got to go to sleep now, you put it down and you can return to it. So you actually return back to this storyline, which is becoming important to you. So what about a little bit more about singing? It's not exclusive. Birds sing, completely different phylogenetic line to humans. And amongst the primates, I've seen only the DVDs of this or clips of it, but gibbons sing. They sing duets, but they sing duets to each other, and they bond for, I understand, for a lifetime. And the singing is between them, so the male will sing, the female will return, the male will return, and these are individualized songs. So a lot of bird songs are highly repetitive and stereotyped and learned. They are born to sing only certain tunes, if I can put it like that. Well, it's not true for all birds, but for most of them. But certainly singing as possibly an emotional relationship has occurred in other primates, but with us it is extremely important. So this is poor Ajabu, who actually died in Amsterdam Zoo, and the mother, as apes very often do, holds on to the dead infant for several days. What's interesting about this is this particular animal, and so I have some other images too, led, the sort of headline to the paper is visitors came to the zoo to see this scene, and visitors cried. But mother never cried. Okay? Mother never cried. But the visitors cried. So again, this is our response. Where, possibly, can this evolutionary effect have emerged? Now, I'm not an anthropologist. We all have an interest in our origins, and I just have to say that every time I make up a slide about something that happened 2 million years ago, somebody produces a paper which says it happened 3 million years ago. So we're always going back in time. But this is just a phylogenetic tree, and of course we didn't go in a straight line like this, but I just want to draw your attention to one or two things here. There's Australopithecus down here, which is several million years ago. I'm going to draw attention to the Australopithecans, to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus here, and then Homo sapiens. And what has happened, of course, along the way, amongst other things, is the increase in cranial size, the increase in size of the brain. So this is one of the earliest Australopithecines ever discovered. Lucy, I keep Lucy because she's been overtaken now by some Australopithecine that was 4 million years old. I mean, but I've got this image and I like to keep her. So obviously it's an image. She was bipedal, that means she had walked on 2 legs. She obviously had babies. Did she cry? Well, we haven't the first idea. Now this is handyman, Homo habilis. Something interesting about Homo habilis, his brain size, as we see, was not too great, 600 cc's perhaps, or even less. But he started doing things. He started making stone-flaked objects. Nobody's entirely clear what they were for. They might have been related to hunting or whatever. But the peculiar thing about it is that he just kept on doing it, or at least the Homo habilis kept on doing it, for literally 1.5 million years. That's an awful long time to keep on producing the same artifact. But there was no great development in artistic representation for a very, very long time. Now, what about Homo erectus, 1.5 million years ago? Now, the artist who's done this, I don't know why, but I want you just to note the eyes. Somewhere along our evolution, the sclera surrounding the iris became white and not black. If you don't believe me, go to any zoo and look in the eyes of chimpanzees. And what happens with that? Well, the eye and the iris become much more important in terms of signaling in the early ancestors, our hominid ancestors. And I'm, of course, emphasizing the importance of that, importance of the eye in relationship to human behavior, and then the release of tears, which adds that huge extra signal to emotion. So here's some speculation. Where and why and how might these have happened? It is speculation, but I give you the following possibility. Now, Prometheus was a Greek god, and he did something terrible, according to Zeus. He gave humans fire. And he was punished for it. I don't want to go into the gruesome story there, but he was punished badly for it. But he gave us fire. Now, Zeus didn't like that, because with fire, all kinds of things happened. But one of the things that happened was that humans began to cook. And cooking, when you think about it, was one of the very earliest transitions of nature into culture. So, what is one of our most important cultural activities? It's cooking. I mean, on television you can't get away from MasterChef and all these kind of things. Go to bookshops, it's full of cooking. It's extraordinarily important. But let's just put it in the context of the campfire. So, when our very, very early ancestors came out of the treetops into the savannah, and when the hunter-gatherer communities emerged, then at the end of the day, what did they do? Well, they caught food, they had vegetables, and with fire, there was a huge increase in the amount of energy that could come from a single portion of meat or vegetable, or whatever. Cooking increases the calorific input hugely, and also made it easier to digest. So again, the amount of energy given to the stomach could be released to develop cerebral activities. And I put down here rituals, stories, ancestors, songs, dancing, and musical development. So let's just go back a little bit. We see that babies, one here, learn from their mothers about the effect of tears. Mothers learn about the effect of tears, but also they learn about noise, music. The first musical instrument was the human voice. And so here we have the first human voice, or first instrument represented by the human voice, round a campfire, and they're together at the end of the feast. Now, I'm saying this is a time when they didn't have speech like I have speech, propositional speech. It must have been emotional speech. It must have been a language which preceded our more precise language with which I am speaking now. And so what would they have done? Well, I would suggest they may well have hummed or started to sing, not necessarily with words, but they would certainly have had musical intonation, and they would dance, because singing and dancing went together. So I'm suggesting that the development from an evolutionary perspective, not only of singing and dancing, but also the emotional bonding that goes with singing and dancing, around, for example, a campfire experience after eating, was an important part of group cohesion, which had huge evolutionary impacts in terms of the development of not only early human societies, but also human culture. So there are people who say, oh, evolution would be the same without singing, without any music whatsoever. I really don't believe that. I think that singing, music and dancing were hugely important in terms of the evolutionary push to the development of Homo sapiens. So the hunter-gatherers, we're talking about groups of people, maybe up to 150 people, maybe more, maybe less. They had to eat their food immediately. You can see on the other side the difference between them and us, if you like, the way that things became organized later. But they had burials. They actually also had cremation because of fire. And there began a time, not very clear exactly what this was or when it was, when they actually started burying the deceased with items, presumably to take on some journey. And that, of course, is representative of many, many religious activities today. And so at some point in time, in relationship to these activities, singing and dancing, our language must have evolved considerably so that we were able to tell stories and develop myths. And I put down there a proto-language. I'm suggesting that the first languages before our kind of language today was emotionally expressive, and that the uttered sequences, whatever they were, had to matter to the people you were uttering them to. But it was somehow during these very early phases that the signals, both of tearing but also the signals of language, became embodied and embedded into our own emotional repertoire. And I'm suggesting that these had to be gut experiences. They had to be experiences which began with the autonomic nervous system, with the nervous system which leads to gut feelings, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. And with this language, which eventually became rhythmic, iterative, and recursive, you developed the behavioral synchrony with others. And we briefly talked about rhythm. Again, we're going to talk about this tomorrow, but it is of importance. I've emphasized about singing and dancing, but it's very interesting that entrainment, that is, being able to continue a rhythm to a beat, is an exclusive human attribute, like crying. So again, I know you can tell me there's a YouTube showing an elephant beating a drum. I've seen that, yes. But that elephant isn't going to do what the kids do all night down at the discotheque. In other words, entrainment to rhythm is an exclusively human activity. And Nigel Osborne talked a bit earlier on about, and we actually saw the other demonstrations too, how rhythmic drum beats were extremely relevant to certainly your music, but also to our music. And surely those most skilled at sensing the meaning of others, in other words, the expression of others, and also in expressing themselves in singing, in dancing, but also in terms of crying, would have had an evolutionary advantage. And so this symbolic revolution, the development of what we would call our cultures today, probably began some 150,000 years ago with an unsophisticated propositional language, which is not the language I'm talking to you with now, which I would call a sophisticated propositional language. And at some point along the way, that very, very early group community would have been together, and then something happened. Somebody in the group disappeared and died. Now there's something else of importance here that has to do with being a mammal. All mammals dream. Now, we don't know what mammals dream about, except we all have seen our pet dogs moving in their sleep. All mammals dream, and humans dream. And so for the very early hominid ancestors, what would they perhaps dream about? Well, we dream about our friends, our deceased friends, our parents, in my case, maybe. And so very, very early on in human mentality, in the human cognition, came the idea that there was another world to get to, and you could get to it, and you did get to it through a state of dreaming. And so if there was this other world, then how do you do that? And out of this, of course, developed a search for origins, myth, and religion. And from myth and religion, we have the development of symbolic representation in art. Now, the symbolic representation in art, as I've already suggested, is rather different to the symbolic non-representation which you have in music, although the music in and of itself must have led to bringing together people in harmony and acting in unison. So just running up to the end here is our not immediate ancestor, but an ancestor who was around when early Homo sapiens was around, a Neanderthal man, just on the verge of this symbolic revolution. They have been shown from skeletons that have been recovered and DNA which has been looked at to have possessed a language-related gene, which is becoming quite important in in evolutionary neuroscience, the FOXP2 gene. It's not exactly the same as that of Homo sapiens, but they may have had or must have had some kind of pre-language from that which we have today. I've mentioned about Burial of the Dead and the Dreams, but an anthropologist called Mittan wrote a book called The Singing Neanderthals. And this was a highly experienced anthropologist who was suggesting that not only did our spoken language and music come from that proto-language, it evolved from primate calls, it lacked words but was emotional and had intonation, pitch, rhythm and melody, and he referred to this as a musy language. Now again, I have to tell you that a lot of people who say there's no relationship between music and language at all. But the evidence, as I review it, and the evidence that I'm putting together here, particularly with regards to our love of music, relates to this. And so we've had at least for 40,000 years of good music. There's been some early musical instruments recovered, an old bone flute from the Neanderthal time. And then the Paleolithic cave paintings show images of dancing, and the suggestion obviously is there's music as well. And interestingly, I was going to show tomorrow, there's an image that comes from some of them from the Indian cave paintings. They're not sure when they were dated, but they show group dancing and singing. We come on to now really the modern era, the Greek theatre, the amphitheatre here in Athens, and the development of a combination of a religious ceremony with music and with poetry. Now remember, the things that lead people to cry most relate to music, poetry is in there, and also religious ceremonies are particularly important. And so this feeling, this group feeling, this campfire feeling that brings people or brought people together and enhanced not only language but also the feelings that related to music and dancing, group cohesion, I suggest is a feeling that we still have when we go and experience tragedy and sadness in the cinema, or in Nigel's case, in my case too, particularly in relationship to opera. I mean, why would you go to the theatre to cry, for heaven's sake? Why do we go to opera to see tragedy at the end? Well, the answer is because it leaves you with a very special feeling. And my own belief is that feeling is a pre-literate feeling. You can't explain it to people. And also, in relationship to crying, if you cry, you can't speak, as I said earlier on. You actually, at the end of a wonderful opera, then you actually don't want or can't speak, and you're choked. And it's because of these very, very early feelings that impinge upon the much later developed sophisticated language cortex. It's early hominid social bonding activity related to group cohesion. So finally then, the social unity of feelings expressed through art have a number of things in common. Their early evolutionary origins, pre-literate proto-language, linked to feelings of awareness, but also then loss of another or loss of something, leading to grief and sadness. But also these feelings are linked to tears, and tears are linked, initially at least, to the development of those emotional events and the bonding. So, are laughing and crying good for you? Well, I suggest that there are people who may take exception to this, but I don't believe that we would be here, Homo sapiens, with a lot of the cultural richness that we have, if we did not have laughing and crying as emotional expressions embodied within us. It appears that most mood is enhanced by laughing and crying. People do feel better after going to the theatre and having a good cry. But with regards to laughing and crying, crying is the more ambiguous of the two. So I accept that there are people who cry and do not feel good after crying, and I've not discussed the whole issue of crying in relationship to a depressive illness, which is well beyond what I wanted to discuss. However, are laughing and crying good for you? Generally, the answer is yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Trimble. We invite Dr. E.S. Krishnamurthy to moderate the question and answer session.
Given the time, I thought we should restrict ourselves to 3 burning questions. And so therefore, I will reach out to 3 hands that go up first. Professor Ramaswamy.
Tears are not necessarily associated with negative emotions. We also hear about tears of joy.
Yes.
That is number 1. Number 2 is tears are de-stressors. I remember reading a poem long ago at school. Home they brought the warrior dead. The warrior was brought dead, and the wife of the warrior would not weep. She would not shed tears. She was silent, absolutely unemotional. And then the nurse, seeing her plight, took the child and put her on her lap. Immediately she started crying. And this probably saved her from the consequences of suppressed emotions. Is that a de-stressor? Churchill also was shedding tears, we hear. Many great leaders do shed tears.
Yes, but she didn't have an onion, that's the point. She forgot the onion, she left it at home. I haven't had time to talk about tears of joy. And in fact, we know very little about tears of joy. There's virtually no literature on tears of joy. And I don't mind saying in this audience, but I've been approached by the lottery fund in England, because they find that a lot of people cry when they give them the cheque for £1 million. And well, it's kind of interesting that people don't express great happiness at that particular moment, but they do express tears of joy. And tears of joy is well worth studying, again, as an emotional response. And the only thing about tears of joy which we know from the Olympics, I don't know how many watch the Olympics, but everybody cries in the Olympics. The winners, the losers, the trainers, the mothers, the fathers, everybody shed tears. So tears of joy are very important, but I've not studied them and they've not been studied. But I hope to study it because I think I'm going to win the lottery.
Okay, I would like to address a question to you.
Oh, yes.
I'm here.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Now, crying in a happy situation enhances the happiness. Crying in a sad situation gives a relief to sadness. But at the same time, both are resulting in tears rolling down the cheeks. Are there any chemical changes in the composition of the tears, in happiness and sadness?
I think that's a very interesting question, and it's not been studied, but what has been studied is the difference between tears which are released with onions, if you like, artificially, and tears which are released watching a sad movie. But it's not very illuminating, unfortunately. What you tend to do is you find more proteins in the tears released emotionally. I think people at the moment are rather interested in hormones, like the amount of cortisol in the tears, and there's a lot of interest now in oxytocin and prolactin and other hormones, but my bet is that they're not in tears. But there's a suggestion that the release of hormones internally, such as oxytocin, have something to do with the feelings that are related to crying. But it's a bit difficult to do these studies artificially, and as far as I know, there's only about 2 studies that have been done that have looked at differences between tears, but not the 2 groups you're talking about. Yeah.
I want to know, what about crocodile tears? They say that they manipulate tears and then acting. Why they came as a crocodile? Do they really have tears, or why you use it for human beings?
No, this is extremely important actually. The story of crocodiles is as follows: that the crocodile usually catches people by the feet, and then it eats them upwards like this. And then when it gets to the head, it doesn't like hair. And so it realizes what it's done, and it sees the human face, but doesn't want to eat it, so it cries. Let me be clear. I of course was making a joke, but that is the myth, the ancient myth about crocodile tears, that they couldn't bear to eat them when they got to the top and saw the face.
Do you cry during dreams and then sleep? Do you cry?
Look, I think that's very interesting. I haven't the first idea. Does anybody cry during a dream? Yes. Well, that's very interesting. I've never been asked that question, and I find that very interesting. Can I, again, for those who just put their hand up, is it you are aware of actually crying, or you are in a dream where you cry? Yeah, that's very interesting. I've never even thought about it. Thank you for the question.
I think wherever that Miss World or Miss Universe, if you see the first picture, they're always crying, maybe because of happiness.
Onions.
Dr. Trimble, I don't know whether you have observed it or not, especially in our Indian culture, more so in South India. Ladies, they cry most if they lose their spouses or children or somebody, not only just crying or repeated crying or something, holding crying or something like that, but they go on singing, sort of a rhythmical singing, or recollecting and recalling all the past, what their disease has done, and what the things they have done. And also, ladies must have observed that the individual crying, suppose a spouse of a dead is crying with a rhythmical way, oh my Lord, you have done this, you have done that, you have dreamed like that and all that. And the onlookers, they would try to. So don't you think it is a sort of a draining out emotions and with this thing, and they feel very good out of it after that? Have you observed this things? I want to know your experience. Thank you.
Well, I think you're referring to the issue of the response of one person to another.
And also singing while crying.
Yes, but I think the only explanation I have, it reflects on our ability, well, the singing I've discussed as an emotional response that doesn't need words, but singing plus tears, again, is, you will see this in many ceremonies, particularly religious ceremonies. And again, this is just from the point of view of the Christian church. If you go back to 200 years, 300 years, again, you are expected, particularly in a Catholic church, you were expected to cry. If you didn't cry, it meant that you really did not have those feelings for God as you should have. And the Puritans who came along, the Protestants and then the Puritans, actually stopped music in churches, in part because they wanted people not to cry, but to devote themselves purely intellectually to the religious activities. So crying and singing in certain situations closely go together, but it's often worried people who want to suppress emotions. Oh, thank you, Krish.
Please give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. there's also the famous quote, Professor, I laugh so that I may not cry, the Babar of Seville. So with those, we've heard a wonderful lecture. We have more to come. This is a festival season, so it's full of treats here today. And we have T.M. Krishna here to talk to us. But between the two, may I invite you to join us for South Indian Tiffin. May I request the younger people to go a little further so that those who are the senior citizens don't have to walk that far. Thank you.